never should have ignored the first time it happened, but after 3 decades of cemetery work, you learn to rationalize almost anything. My name is Alan Briggs, though everyone at Greenwood Memorial Cemetery in Salem, Oregon calls me Al. I've been the head groundskeeper here since 1993, and before this autumn, I thought I understood every square foot of these 72 acres. I was wrong. It started on a Tuesday morning in late September. I arrived at dawn like always, thermos of coffee in hand, ready to walk my usual route through the older sections before the gates opened. The fog was thick that morning, settling between headstones like something alive, making the granite markers look like they were floating. I was checking for vandalism, fallen branches, the usual maintenance concerns. That's when I first noticed row 9C. The grave belonged to a man named Victor Marsh, died in 1987 at age 41. The plot was unremarkable in every way. Simple granite marker, no flowers, rarely visited. But that morning, there was fresh dirt on top of the grave. Not scattered dirt, not soil that had washed down from the nearby hill. This dirt was arranged in a pattern. 2 handprints, perfect handprints, pressing upward from below. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just staring. The prints were too deliberate to be accidental, too symmetrical to be natural settling. Each finger was distinct, the palms clearly defined. I crouched down, telling myself it was probably kids playing a prank, maybe using a mold or something. But when I touched the soil, my hand jerked back. It was warm, not sun-warmed. The sun had barely risen, and the fog kept everything cool and damp. This was body warm, heat radiating up from dirt that should have been cold. I filled it in, smoothed it over, told myself I'd imagined the temperature. Then I went about my day, trimming hedges near the chapel, fixing a loose section of fence by the main gate, replacing wilted flowers on the newer graves. Normal work, routine work. The next morning, the handprints were back. Same spot, same formation. 2 palms, 10 fingers, all pressing upward like someone beneath the soil was trying to push through. The dirt was warm again, almost as hot this time. I could feel the heat through my work gloves. I checked the burial records that afternoon. Victor Marsh had been buried in a standard casket, but the family had paid extra for something unusual, a concrete vault seal. Not just the typical outer burial container, but a full concrete cap poured over the top of the vault. It was meant to be permanent, immovable, a barrier between the casket and the earth above. Nothing should have been able to disturb that soil. I filled in the handprints again. This time, I packed the dirt down hard, used my boot to compress it, made sure the surface was completely level. I even watered it, thinking maybe if the soil was damp and heavy, whatever was causing this would stop. The next morning, the handprints were there again, bigger this time. The fingers spread wider, the palms deeper, like whatever was below was pressing harder. The soil was so warm now that steam rose from it in the cool morning air. I should have reported it, should have called the cemetery director, maybe even the police. But what would I say? That a grave sealed with concrete was somehow pushing dirt up in the shape of hands, that the earth was warm when it shouldn't be. They'd think I was losing my mind, so I kept filling it in every morning for 3 weeks. By the second week, I started arriving earlier, 5 in the morning, sometimes 4:30. I wanted to catch whoever was doing this, wanted to see the moment it happened, but I never did. The handprints were always there when I arrived, always warm, always in that same upward pressing position. James, one of the other groundskeepers, noticed me spending extra time in that section. He asked if something was wrong with the drainage in row 9C. I told him the soil was settling weird, that I was keeping an eye on it. He offered to help, but I told him I had it handled. I didn't want him to feel what I felt every morning when I touched that dirt. During the third week, I started having dreams. Not nightmares exactly, but close. I'd dream I was standing at the grave, and the handprints would start moving. The fingers would curl, then press flat again, curl and press, like someone doing push ups beneath 6 feet of earth and concrete. In the dreams, I could hear breathing, slow and rhythmic, patient. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, but I'd still go to work, still walk to row 9C, still find those handprints waiting. On the 21st day, something changed. The handprints were there as usual, but this time there was something else. Between the two palm prints, the dirt had been pushed aside in a small divot, like a finger had traced a line in the soil. It took me a moment to realize what I was looking at. It was a word, scratched into the dirt in shaky, uneven letters. Help. My hands were shaking when I filled it in that morning. I didn't smooth it carefully like I usually did. I just shoveled dirt over it as fast as I could, packed it down, and walked away. I called in sick the next 2 days, told them I had the flu. When I came back, I brought a bag of gravel from the maintenance shed. After I filled in the handprints that morning, and yes, they were still there, still warm, I spread a thick layer of gravel over the entire grave. Then I placed a heavy concrete garden bench on top of it. Told the director it was for visitors, that the marsh plot could use some decoration. That was 6 weeks ago. The handprints haven't appeared since I put the bench there, but sometimes, early in the morning, when I'm doing my rounds, I walk past row 9C, and I swear I can feel heat radiating up through the concrete. I don't stop to check anymore. I don't touch the bench to see if it's warm, and I never, ever move it. Because the thing is, Victor Marsh was buried with a concrete seal, the kind that's supposed to last forever, the kind that nothing should be able to push through. But every morning, I remember the feel of that warm dirt, and I remember that word scratched between the handprints. Help. I don't know what's down there. I don't know if it's Victor Marsh or something else. I don't know if it's still trying to get out. But I know that bench is staying exactly where it is. Some things, you learn, are better left buried. Every cemetery has a rule we don't talk about. Ours is simple. Never put fresh flowers on plot 114 unless you want to watch them die. My name is Margaret Kemper, and I have served as funeral director at Riverside Memorial Gardens in Bend, Oregon for nearly 18 years. In that time, I have coordinated over 2,000 services, helped countless families through their grief, and learned to recognize when something is wrong with a burial site. Plot 114 has been wrong since the day we put Gerald Whitmore in the ground. The funeral itself was unremarkable. Gerald had been 73, a retired accountant, survived by his wife of 49 years. Eleanor Whitmore was a quiet woman, the kind who keeps her grief close and her words careful. The service was small, maybe 20 people. Gerald hadn't been particularly social, Eleanor told me. He preferred his own company, his books, his routines. The first time I noticed something strange was during the graveside service. Eleanor had brought an arrangement of white lilies, Gerald's supposed favorite, according to the funeral home's intake form. But when I glanced at Eleanor during the committal prayer, I saw her staring at those lilies with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not sadness, something closer to apprehension. After the service ended and the family had left, I stayed behind to make sure everything was in order. The groundskeepers would fill the grave once we were gone, but I liked to take a moment, make sure the flowers were arranged properly, that the temporary marker was secure. It was a habit I'd developed over the years, a final check before leaving the deceased to their rest. That's when I noticed the lilies. They were wilting, not drooping the way flowers naturally do in heat. This was different. The petals were turning round at the edges, curling inward, like they had been held over a flame. I touched one, and it crumbled between my fingers, dry as autumn leaves, despite having been fresh that morning. I told myself it was the sun. Early June in Oregon can be warm, and flowers can be delicate. I made a note to mention it to Eleanor, maybe suggest silk arrangements for future visits. Then I went back to the funeral home and didn't think about it again. Until Eleanor called 3 days later. She'd visited the grave that morning, she said, brought fresh flowers. Within an hour, they'd turned black. Not brown, not wilted, black, like they'd been burned from the inside out. I drove out to the cemetery that afternoon. Eleanor was standing beside plot 114, staring down at a bouquet of yellow roses that looked like they'd been dipped in ash. The petals were brittle, the stems blackened, and when the wind picked up, pieces of them scattered across the grass like dark snow. He always hated flowers, Eleanor said quietly. She didn't look at me when she spoke. I thought maybe in death it wouldn't matter, but Gerald never did change his mind about anything. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just stood there with her. After a moment, she left, and I was alone with the grave and those ruined flowers. I started paying attention after that. Over the next few months, I watched. Other families visited plot 114. Eleanor came every Sunday, and almost all of them brought flowers. Within hours, sometimes minutes, those flowers would die. Roses, carnations, daisies, even hardy mums that should have lasted weeks. They all turned black, their petals curling and crumbling like paper held too close to fire. I tested it myself one morning, brought a bouquet of fresh sunflowers from the grocery store, bright and healthy, and placed them on Gerald's grave just after dawn. I sat on a nearby bench pretending to review paperwork, but really I was watching. It took 45 minutes. The sunflowers started from the center, the bright yellow petals darkening to brown, then gray, then black. It spread outward like an infection, moving through the petals one by one. By the time an hour had passed, the entire arrangement looked like it had been pulled from a fire. The stems were brittle, the leaves had turned to ash. I pulled them away and examined the ground. The soil was normal, no excessive heat, no chemical smell, nothing that would explain why the flowers died so quickly and so completely. I even called the cemetery's landscaping company, asked if there was something wrong with that particular plot. They sent someone out to test the soil. It came back normal, perfectly average cemetery earth. But the flowers kept dying. Word spread among the families who visited the cemetery regularly. People started avoiding Plot 114 when they walked past, the way you might avoid a grave that's too fresh, too painful to look at. Eleanor stopped bringing flowers after a while, started bringing stones instead, small, smooth river rocks she'd arrange in careful patterns on top of the grave marker. He can't kill stones, she told me once, and there was something in her voice that made my skin prickle. The incident that still keeps me awake happened during a burial service this past October. The grave was 3 plots away from Gerald's, a woman named Patricia Harding, 68 years old. The family had requested an elaborate floral arrangement on her casket, white roses and orchids woven together with ivy. I was standing with the family during the committal when I noticed something wrong with the flowers on Patricia's casket. The roses closest to Plot 114 were turning brown. Not all of them, just the ones on that side of the arrangement. As I watched, the discoloration spread, petals darkening and curling even as the minister spoke the final prayers. No one else seemed to notice. They were focused on the minister, on their grief, on saying goodbye, but I couldn't look away. The flowers were dying in real time, a slow creep of decay moving through the white petals like spilled ink through paper. By the time the service ended, half the arrangement was ruined. I stood there after everyone had left, staring between Patricia's grave and Gerald's, 3 plots away. The flowers hadn't even been placed on his grave, just near it, and they'd still died. Eleanor visited the following Sunday. I happened to be at the cemetery, coordinating another service, and I saw her standing at Gerald's grave with her collection of river stones. She was arranging them in a circle around the marker, her movements slow and methodical. I walked over, asked her how she was doing. She looked up at me with eyes that seemed much older than they should have been. "He's angry," she said simply. "He's been angry since the day we met. I just didn't realize anger could survive death." She placed the last stone and stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "He hated beauty," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hated anything soft or gentle. I used to keep a garden before we married. He made me tear it all out, said it was a waste of time." Eleanor looked at the grave for a long moment, then back at me. I thought he might be different now, but Gerald never changed his mind about anything. She walked away, and I stayed there, looking at Plot 114 with its circle of stones and its history of dead flowers. I thought about Gerald Whitmore, a man who hated beauty so much that even death couldn't soften him. Now, when families ask about plots available in that section, I quietly steer them elsewhere. And when someone brings flowers to a grave near Gerald's, I don't tell them what I know. I just make a note in my calendar to check on those flowers the next day, to remove them before anyone else sees what Plot 114 can do. Because some hatreds, I've learned, don't end with the last breath. They just find new ways to bloom. If you ever hear someone calling your name from an empty crypt, don't answer. I learned that too late. My name is Yolanda Torres, and I have worked as a mortuary transport driver for Cascade Valley Funeral Services in Eugene, Oregon for the past 9 years. I have moved more bodies and caskets than I care to count, driven through snowstorms and heat waves, worked every holiday and graveyard shift that came my way. Before last April, I thought I understood every aspect of my job. I was wrong. The morning I delivered casket 44 started like any other. I arrived at the funeral home just before dawn, signed in, checked my route sheet, and began loading the van. The casket belonged to a man named Richard Holloway, 76 years old, former postal worker. His family had chosen entombment at Oak Ridge Mausoleum rather than traditional burial. Standard procedure, I'd done this same route dozens of times. Casket 44 was a mid-range model, bronze finish, nothing remarkable about it. I wheeled it out on the church truck, secured it in the van with the proper straps, and made sure all the paperwork was in the waterproof pouch attached to the handles. Entombment was scheduled for 10 in the morning, but the family wanted the casket delivered early so they could have private time before the service. I drove to Oak Ridge just as the sun was coming up. The mausoleum sat at the back of the cemetery property, a limestone building with columns and stained glass windows that caught the early light. Beautiful in its way, though I'd never been comfortable with mausoleums. Something about the idea of bodies stacked in walls instead of buried in earth always unsettled me. Robert, the mausoleum caretaker, met me at the entrance. He'd been working there longer than I'd been doing transport, a quiet man in his 60s who kept the building immaculate. Together, we wheeled casket 44 inside and positioned it in front of crypt 17, the space the Holloway family had purchased. The casket faced outward, toward the main hall, the way it was supposed to be positioned for viewing before entombment. I checked the seal, made sure everything was secure, handed Robert the paperwork that needed to be signed. He initialed the delivery form, gave me my copy, and I left. Simple, routine, done. I had 3 other transports that day, a cremation pickup, and 2 removals from hospital morgues. I didn't get back to Oak Ridge until almost 3 in the afternoon. The family had requested I pick up the floral arrangements after the entombment was complete, deliver them to a local care facility that accepted funeral flowers. Another standard request. Robert met me at the entrance again, but this time his face was strange, pale. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there holding the door open with an expression I couldn't read. "Everything all right?" I asked. He hesitated. "You should probably see this." We walked through the mausoleum together, our eyes footsteps echoing off the marble floors. The building was quiet, empty now that the family had left. The afternoon light came through the stained glass in colors, reds and blues painting the walls. When we reached Crypt 17, I stopped. Casket 44 had been rotated 180 degrees. It now faced the wall, the foot end where the head should have been, the nameplate pressed against the limestone instead of visible from the hall. I stood there, trying to understand what I was seeing. Did the family request this? No. Robert's voice was barely above a whisper. I left after you delivered it this morning. When the family arrived at 9:30, it was positioned correctly. After the service ended and they left, I locked up the building, took my lunch break in the office. When I came back to start the entombment process, it was like this. Someone must have moved it. The building was locked. I'm the only one with a key. I walked closer, examined the casket. The seal was still intact. The same seal I'd checked that morning. The straps were still in place on the church truck, nothing disturbed, but the casket had definitely been turned around. Maybe the family moved it before they left. Robert shook his head. I was here for the entire service. No one touched it. And Yolanda, I've been doing this for 23 years. You know how heavy these caskets are once they're occupied. It would take at least 2 people to rotate one, probably more. And even then, it wouldn't be quiet. The wheels on the church truck squeak. I would have heard something. I checked the wheels. He was right. They squeaked when I tested them, loud enough to hear from anywhere in the building. We stood there in silence, looking at casket 44 facing the wrong direction. The afternoon light was fading, shadows growing longer between the crypts. The building felt colder than it should have. We need to turn it back around, I said finally. The family will be back tomorrow for the final entombment. They can't see it like this. It took both of us, and even then it was difficult. The casket was heavy, the wheels resistant. By the time we'd repositioned it correctly, I was sweating despite the cool air in the mausoleum. We checked the seal again, made sure everything was exactly as it should be, and I gathered the floral arrangements to load in my van. I should have left right then, should have walked out of Oak Ridge Mausoleum and never looked back. But as I was carrying the last arrangement toward the exit, I heard something. My name. Quiet. Almost too quiet to hear, coming from deeper in the building. Yolanda. I stopped, set down the flowers. Robert? No answer. I walked back toward where we'd left casket 44. Robert was in the office now. I could hear him on the phone. The sound hadn't come from that direction. Yolanda. It was coming from the crypts, from the wall. I moved closer, my heart beating too fast, my hands starting to shake. The voice was muffled, distant, like someone speaking through layers of stone. I looked at Crypt 17, at casket 44, positioned correctly now, facing outward toward the hall. The nameplate gleamed in the fading light. Yolanda, wrong way. My breath caught. The voice was coming from inside the crypt, from inside the casket. I backed away, one step, then another. Then I turned and walked quickly toward the exit, my footsteps echoing too loud in the empty hall. I didn't run. Something about running in a mausoleum felt wrong, felt like it might trigger something worse. Robert found me in the parking lot, loading the last of the flowers into my van. "You all right?" he asked. "You look pale." I didn't tell him what I'd heard. Didn't tell him about the voice saying my name, saying "wrong way," like it was a warning or a complaint or something I was supposed to understand. Instead, I finished loading the van, signed the final paperwork, and drove away. The next morning, Robert called me. The family had arrived for the final entombment, and everything had gone smoothly. Casket 44 was now sealed in Crypt 17, behind a marble panel engraved with Richard Holloway's name and dates. He didn't mention the casket's position, didn't say whether it had stayed facing the right direction overnight. I didn't ask. I've delivered to Oak Ridge Mausoleum 4 times since then. Different caskets, different crypts, different families. Each time, I make sure to position everything correctly, check the seals, handle the paperwork, and leave as quickly as possible. And each time, just before I exit the building, I hear something faint, muffled, coming from somewhere in the walls. My name. I never stop to listen anymore, never try to locate which crypt the sound is coming from. I just keep walking, out the door, into the sunlight, into my van. Because I've learned that some deliveries aren't quite finished, even after the casket is sealed and the marble is in place. Some deliveries keep calling your name, and some of them still think they're facing the wrong way. I thought I understood death until the night one of our clients moved. My name is Jude Castellano, and I have worked as a licensed embalmer at Morningside Funeral Home in Tacoma, Washington for 11 years. I have prepared over 1,500 bodies for burial or cremation. I understand rigor mortis, decomposition, the settling of tissues, the tricks that gases and gravity can play on a corpse. What happened with Mr. Halloran wasn't any of those things. He came to us on a Thursday evening in late November, brought in from Providence Hospital, where he'd died of heart failure. Thomas Halloran, 68 years old, retired dentist. His daughter had made the arrangements that afternoon, chosen a simple service, requested a viewing for close family only. Standard case. Nothing about the intake suggested anything unusual. I began the embalming process around 9 that evening, after the last family had left the building. I prefer working at night, always have. The funeral home is quiet then, just the hum of the HVAC system and the occasional creak of old wood settling. I can focus on the work without interruption. Mr. Halloran was positioned on the preparation table, the overhead surgical light adjusted, all my instruments laid out in order. I started with the standard examination, checking for medical devices, documenting any injuries or marks. His face was peaceful, mouth closed, eyes shut, the expression relaxed. It's what we call a good case. No trauma, no difficult restorative work needed. I set the features first, like always. Placed eye caps, used a needle injector to close the mouth, positioned the jaw so it looked natural. Mr. Halloran's mouth stayed closed the way it was supposed to, lips meeting in a slight, neutral line. Nothing unusual, nothing wrong. I'd just started raising the carotid artery when I realized I'd forgotten to bring additional drainage tubes from the supply room. A simple oversight. The supply room was maybe 30 feet away, down a short hall. I'd be gone less than 5 minutes. I removed my gloves, washed my hands at the prep room sink, and walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar like I always did when I was coming right back. The hallway was empty, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. I grabbed what I needed from the supply room and returned to the prep room. That walk couldn't have taken more than 3 minutes, 4 at most. When I pushed open the door, Mr. Halloran was grinning. Not a slight upturn of the lips, not a natural settling of facial muscles. A wide, deliberate grin. His lips were pulled back, teeth fully visible, the expression so exaggerated it looked theatrical. Wrong. The needle injector I'd used to secure his jaw was still in place, still properly positioned, but somehow his mouth had opened anyway. I stood in the doorway, staring. My first thought was that I'd made a mistake, that I hadn't secured the jaw properly and it had dropped open. But that didn't explain the expression. Jaws drop when they're not secured. They fall slack. They hang. They don't pull up into smiles. I approached the table slowly, examining Mr. Halloran's face under the surgical light. The muscles were in full rigor mortis, which should have made any movement impossible. But there he was, grinning like someone had just told him the world's best joke. I checked the needle injector. It was still properly seated, the barbs still engaged in the tissue exactly where I'd placed them. Nothing had slipped, nothing had come loose. I removed the device, reset his features, and used a different method this time, suture string, jaw secured from the inside. It's a more permanent solution, one that shouldn't come undone. I worked carefully, making sure everything was exactly right, then stepped back to check my work. Mr. Halloran's face was peaceful again, neutral, appropriate. I washed my hands again, pulled on fresh gloves, and returned to the arterial embalming. I worked in silence, periodically glancing at Mr. Halloran's face to make sure it stayed the way I'd positioned it. Everything seemed fine, normal. The embalming fluid was flowing properly. The body was responding as expected. After about 40 minutes, I needed to adjust the overhead light. I reached up, shifted the angle, and in the second I wasn't looking directly at him, something changed. When I looked back, Mr. Halloran was grinning again. This time, my hands started shaking. The suture string was still in place. I could see the thread at the corners of his mouth, but his lips had pulled back again, teeth showing, that same exaggerated expression of joy or mockery or whatever it was. I stepped away from the table, took off my gloves, walked to the corner of the prep room where we keep the security camera monitor. Every prep room in our funeral home has overhead cameras now, installed 5 years ago after a lawsuit about an improper handling. The cameras record everything, constant surveillance, the footage saved for 30 days before being overwritten. I pulled up the feed from the current evening, scrolled back to when I'd left for the supply room. The footage showed me working on Mr. Halloran, setting his features, positioning his jaw. Then it showed me leaving the room, the door swinging partly closed behind me. The timestamp showed me gone for 3 minutes and 17 seconds. During those 3 minutes, Mr. Halloran didn't move. The camera showed him lying exactly as I'd left him, mouth closed, face peaceful. Then, between one frame and the next, his expression changed. Not gradually, not in a way that showed movement. One frame, his mouth was closed. The next frame, he was grinning. I watched it 5 times. Rewound, watched again. The change happened in the space between frames. In the fraction of a second, the camera wasn't recording. One moment neutral, the next moment smiling, with nothing in between to explain the transition. I checked the footage from when I'd adjusted the light. Same thing. One frame normal, next frame grinning, no movement, no progression, just an instantaneous change that shouldn't have been possible. I stood there for a long time, watching the monitor, watching Mr. Halloran's body lying still on the table behind me. I could see both simultaneously, the recorded version and the real one. On the monitor, his face kept shifting between frames. In real life, he lay there grinning up at the ceiling. I should have called someone. My supervisor, another embalmer, someone from the family. But what would I say? That a dead man kept smiling at me? That the camera showed him changing expressions in the space between recorded frames? Instead, I went back to work. I finished the embalming, applied massage cream, cleaned him up, moved him to the dressing table. I worked carefully, professionally, trying to ignore the fact that his mouth kept pulling into that grin no matter how many times I reset it. Eventually, I gave up trying to fix it. I dressed him in the clothes his daughter had provided, positioned him in the casket she'd chosen, and arranged his features one final time. This time, I used a combination of techniques: sutures, adhesive, even a small amount of superglue at the corners of his mouth. Everything I could think of to keep his expression neutral. Then I turned off the prep room lights, cleaned my instruments, and went home. The viewing was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. I arrived early, before the family, to make sure everything was in order. I opened the casket, bracing myself for what I might see. Mr. Halloran's face was peaceful, neutral, exactly as I'd positioned it the night before. The slight smile we give the deceased to make them look at rest, nothing more. No grin, no exposed teeth, just a quiet, dignified expression appropriate for a viewing. His daughter arrived with her family. They cried, held hands, said goodbye. They told me how natural he looked, how much it helped to see him at peace. They thanked me for my work. I smiled, accepted their gratitude, and didn't mention the prep room, the grinning, the camera footage that I'd downloaded to a flash drive and hidden in my locker. I haven't worked night shift alone since then. When I have evening embalmings, I make sure someone else is in the building, even if they're just in the office doing paperwork. I don't want to be alone with the bodies anymore. Don't want to leave the room, even for a minute, and come back to find something changed. Because I've learned that what happens between frames, in those tiny gaps where cameras can't quite see, isn't always nothing. Sometimes it's a smile, and sometimes that smile is waiting to see if you'll notice it. The shift was routine until I noticed a name in the records that shouldn't exist anymore. My name is David Ming, and I have worked as the primary caretaker at Willowbrook Cemetery in Portland, Oregon for the past 14 years. I maintain the grounds, coordinate with funeral directors, keep the records, and occasionally guide visitors who are looking for specific graves. It's quiet work, meditative in its way. Before last winter, I thought I knew every corner of these 48 acres, every grave dating back to the cemetery's founding in 1949. I was wrong. I found the visitor log entry on a Sunday morning in December during one of those gray Portland days where the fog never quite lifts and everything feels suspended between seasons. I was in the administrative office catching up on paperwork, going through some of the older files we'd been slowly digitizing. The project had been ongoing for months, scanning decades of handwritten records into our new database system. I was working my way through a box of visitor logs from the 1950s, those old leather-bound books where people would sign in at the main gate if they wanted to visit outside of regular hours. Most of the entries were straightforward: names, dates, which grave they were visiting, how long they stayed, routine documentation that helped us track cemetery traffic and maintain security. That's when I saw her name, Elizabeth Wardell, dated March 17th, 1954. She'd requested permission to visit Grave 12. I stared at the entry for a long moment, trying to place why it bothered me. Then I checked our plot map. Grave 12 hadn't been established until 1971. Before that, the entire northwest section where it now sits had been undeveloped land, just grass and trees that we kept cleared for future expansion. I pulled out my phone, opened our digital records, and searched for Grave 12. It belonged to a man named Robert Chen, died in 2002 at age 63. Before that, the plot had belonged to another family who'd purchased it in 1971 but never used it, eventually selling it to the Chens in the 90s. There was no possible way Elizabeth Wardell could have requested to visit that grave in 1954. It didn't exist yet. I checked the log entry again, looking for any sign that it had been added later, maybe written in after the fact. But the ink matched the surrounding entries, same faded blue, same aged paper. The handwriting was neat, careful, feminine, a woman's script from another era. I photographed the page, then continued digitizing. But I kept thinking about that entry, about Elizabeth Wardell requesting to visit a grave that wouldn't exist for 17 more years. The next Sunday, I was doing my usual morning walk through the northwest section when I saw her, an elderly woman, maybe 75 or 80, standing beside Grave 12 with her hands folded in front of her. She wore a long coat despite the relatively mild weather, and her hair was pure white, pulled back in a neat bun. I'd seen her before, many times. She came every Sunday, always around 9 in the morning, always visiting the same grave. She never left flowers, never spoke to anyone, just stood there for exactly 10 minutes before walking back to the parking lot. In all my years at Willowbrook, I'd never heard her say a single word. I'd always assumed she was family, someone related to Robert Chen. But looking at her now, thinking about that visitor log entry, something made me approach her differently than I usually would. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my distance, keeping my voice respectful. "I'm David Ming, the caretaker here. I hope I'm not intruding." She turned to look at me. Her eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, and there was something in her expression that made me take an involuntary step back. Not hostility, not quite. Something else, recognition, maybe, or resignation. "I was wondering," I continued, "if you're family of Mr. Chen." She didn't answer, just looked at me for a long moment, then turned back to the grave. I should have left her alone, should have walked away and respected her privacy like I always did with mourners. But instead, I heard myself asking, "Are you Elizabeth Wardell?" The change in her was immediate. Her shoulders stiffened, her head tilted slightly, and when she looked at me again, there was something different in her eyes, something colder. "Where did you hear that name?" Her voice was quiet, precise, with an accent I couldn't quite place. "The visitor logs," I said. "From 1954, there's an entry for Elizabeth Wardell requesting to visit Grave 12. She studied me for a long moment, then looked back at the grave. "I don't know what you're talking about." But I'd seen the reaction, the recognition, and now, standing close enough to see her face clearly, I noticed something else. She looked exactly like I'd imagined the woman from the visitor log would look. Not younger or older, but preserved somehow, frozen in time, in a way that didn't quite make sense. "This grave didn't exist in 1954, I said. "Then perhaps someone made a mistake in the records." "The handwriting in that log entry," I continued, pulling out my phone, showing her the photograph I'd taken. "It looks like it was written by someone with very neat, careful penmanship, someone educated, someone who learned to write in an earlier era." She glanced at the photo, but said nothing. I pulled up another image on my phone, this one from our current guest book, the one we keep at the main office for visitors who want to leave messages or comments. 3 weeks ago, someone had signed it. The handwriting was neat, careful, feminine, identical to the handwriting in the 1954 log. Elizabeth Wardell. She looked at both images, then back at me. "You should stop looking through old records," she said quietly. "Some things are better left alone." "How long have you been visiting this grave?" "A long time. Before it was dug?" She smiled then, just barely, a sad curve of her lips. "I've been waiting here since they cleared the land. I knew it would be placed here eventually. I just had to be patient." The air felt colder suddenly, the fog pressing in around us. I could hear my own heartbeat, too loud in the quiet cemetery. "Who are you waiting for?" I asked. "Someone who promised to come back." She turned away from me, facing the grave again. "He said he'd return, that nothing could keep him away. I've been here every Sunday since the day he left. I'll be here every Sunday until he does come back." "Robert Chen?" "No." She shook her head. "Robert Chen was a kind man. I'm grateful his family chose this plot. It makes the waiting easier, having someone else here in the meantime, but he's not who I'm waiting for. Then who? She didn't answer, just stood there, hands folded, staring at a grave that had been filled for over 20 years with someone else's remains. I wanted to ask more questions, wanted to understand, but something in her posture told me the conversation was over. I stepped back, gave her privacy, and walked toward the office. When I looked back a few minutes later, she was gone. The fog had thickened, rolling across the grass in waves, and Grave 12 stood alone in the gray morning light. I checked the security footage later. It showed her arriving at 8:57, walking directly to Grave 12, standing there for exactly 10 minutes, then walking back toward the parking lot. Nothing unusual, except the footage was from 1954. I double checked the timestamp, the date in the corner of the screen, but it was right there. March 17th, 1954, same date as the visitor log entry. The woman in the footage wore the same long coat, had the same white hair pulled back in a bun. The cemetery didn't have security cameras in 1954. We didn't install them until 2006. I've stopped digitizing the old visitor logs, stopped looking through the archives. But every Sunday at 9 in the morning, I see her standing beside Grave 12. She never speaks, never leaves flowers, just stands and waits. And I've learned that some visitors aren't mourning the dead. They're waiting for someone who hasn't died yet. Someone who promised to come back to a grave that didn't exist when the promise was made. I don't know who she's waiting for, don't know if he'll ever arrive, but every Sunday, Elizabeth Wardell returns to Grave 12. And every Sunday, the fog rolls in a little thicker, like it's trying to hide something or keep something in. I never should have agreed to take the overnight shift, but I needed the hours, and I didn't believe in ghosts. My name is Marcus Ruiz, and I have worked as a night security watchman at Evergreen Hills Cemetery in Olympia, Washington, for the past 6 years. Before this job, I did private security for office buildings and shopping centers, places where the biggest threat was teenagers breaking in after hours or homeless people looking for shelter. A cemetery seemed like easy work by comparison. Quiet, peaceful, just me and the dead, who I figured wouldn't give me any trouble. I was right about that, mostly. The dead don't cause problems. It's everything else that does. My shift runs from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. The cemetery closes at dusk, gates locked, nobody allowed in or out except for emergency vehicle access. My job is simple: patrol the grounds every hour, check for vandalism or trespassers, monitor the security cameras from the small office near the main entrance, and basically make sure nothing disturbs the peace. For the first 3 years, nothing ever did. I'd walk my rounds, see nothing but headstones and trees, maybe a deer or raccoon wandering through. I'd spend the rest of my time in the office, watching shows on my phone, drinking coffee, counting down the hours until sunrise. Easy money, boring, but easy. The footsteps started in October, 3 years ago. The first time I heard them, I was in the office reviewing the security feeds around 2:30 in the morning. We have 12 cameras positioned throughout the cemetery, covering the main gates, the chapel, the mausoleum, and several key sections of the grounds. I was cycling through the feeds, half paying attention, when I heard it. Footsteps, crunching across gravel. I looked up from the monitors, listening. The sound was coming from outside, somewhere in the direction of what we call the old section, the original part of the cemetery, graves dating back to the 1890s. The footsteps were steady, rhythmic, like someone walking at a measured pace. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, left the office, and headed toward the sound. The October air was cold, mist hanging low over the grass. My breath came out in clouds. I could still hear the footsteps ahead of me, crunching, crunching, steady as a metronome, but when I reached the old section, there was no one there. The footsteps had stopped the moment I came around the chapel. I swept my flashlight across the headstones, illuminating the old granite markers and weathered angels. Nothing moved, nobody running away, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I checked the perimeter fence. No gaps, no signs of entry. Walked through the entire old section with my flashlight, examining every row, empty, silent. I went back to the office, checked the security camera that covers that area. The footage showed exactly what I'd seen with my own eyes. Fog drifting across empty grass, headstones standing silent and still, no people, no movement. But when I turned up the volume on the recording, I heard them, the footsteps, clear as anything, crunch, crunch, crunch across gravel, even though the camera showed nothing but empty cemetery. I saved that footage, labeled it with the date and time, and tried to forget about it. The next night, it happened again. Same time, 2:47 in the morning, same location, the old section, same steady footsteps crunching across gravel that shouldn't have been there because that entire section is grass, no gravel paths anywhere near where the sound was coming from. This time, I didn't go outside. I just pulled up the security feed and watched. The camera showed fog and grass and headstones, nothing else. But the audio picked up those footsteps, walking in a pattern, circling something. I let it play out. The footsteps continued for exactly 4 minutes, walking in what sounded like a circle, then stopped abruptly at 2:51. Over the following weeks, I documented every occurrence. The footsteps happened every single night, always at 2:47, always in the old section, always lasting 4 minutes. I started mapping the sound, trying to figure out where the walking pattern was centered. It took me 3 weeks to pinpoint it. The footsteps were circling a specific grave. Sarah Whitmore, 1872 to 1894, 22 years old when she died. The headstone was simple, weathered limestone, partially hidden by overgrown grass. No flowers, no decorations, no indication that anyone had visited in decades. I researched her during my downtime, found an old newspaper article from 1894 in the local Historical Society archives. Sarah Whitmore had died in childbirth, along with her baby. The article mentioned that her husband, Jonathan Whitmore, had been inconsolable that he'd visited her grave every single day until his own death in 1928. He was buried in a different cemetery across town. His family had moved away from Olympia after Sarah died, and when Jonathan passed, they'd buried him in their new hometown rather than bringing him back. So Sarah was alone, had been alone for over 100 years. I started staying in the office during the footsteps, just listening. The pattern never changed. 2:47, the walking started. 4 minutes of steady circling. 2:51, silence. But last month, something did change. I was at my desk, listening to the footsteps make their nightly circuit when they stopped. Not at 2:51 like usual, at 2:49, right in the middle of the pattern. I pulled up the security feed, watching the empty old section on the monitor. The fog was thicker than usual, rolling across the ground in waves. And then I saw it. Not a person, not exactly, more like a density in the fog, a place where the mist seemed heavier, more substantial. It was standing, if standing is the right word, directly in front of Sarah Whitmore's headstone. I watched as this thing, this concentrated fog, seemed to bend forward, like it was kneeling, like it was placing something on the grave. The audio picked up a sound I'd never heard before, a voice, quiet, distant, muffled by more than a century. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I left you alone." The fog shape stayed there for another minute, kneeling. Then it dissipated, scattered like regular mist. The footsteps didn't resume. At 2:51, everything went quiet, just like always. I saved that footage too, watched it maybe 50 times over the following week. The audio was barely there. You had to turn the volume all the way up to hear it, but the words were clear enough. I visited Sarah Whitmore's grave the next morning after my shift ended. In the daylight, it looked like it always had. Old, neglected, forgotten, but there was something new on top of the headstone. A single white flower, fresh, impossible to identify because I'm not a botanist, but definitely not something that grew wild in the cemetery. Someone, or something, had placed it there. I checked the security footage from the exact moment I'd seen the fog shape kneeling. The video showed nothing but mist. But when that shape had bent forward, something had appeared on the headstone between frames. One frame empty, next frame the flower was there. The footsteps still happen every night at 2:47. Still circle Sarah Whitmore's grave for 4 minutes, still stop at 2:51. But now, every few weeks, they stop early. The fog gathers. The voice speaks, always the same words. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I left you alone." And every time it happens, a new flower appears on the grave. I don't try to explain it anymore. Don't mention it in my incident reports. The cemetery director wouldn't believe me anyway, and the footage just shows fog and audio that could be anything: wind, equipment malfunction, auditory pareidolia. But I know what I hear. I know what I've seen, and I've learned that some people keep promises even after death, even when they're buried miles away, even when the only way they can visit is in footsteps that leave no prints and voices that barely break through the fog. Jonathan Whitmore walks the old section every night at 2:47, and Sarah Whitmore's grave is never without flowers anymore. Some loves, I've learned, are patient enough to outlast death. Some loves walk the same circle for over 100 years, and some promises are kept long after the ground has claimed both people who made them. Every cemetery has a rule we don't talk about. Ours is simple: never sell Plot 22B no matter how much someone wants it. My name is Catherine Ames, and I have served as funeral director at Riverside Memorial Park in Spokane, Washington for 27 years. I have coordinated thousands of services, helped families through unimaginable grief, and learned that some plots of land carry histories that are better left undisturbed. Plot 22B has been empty since 1963, and if I have any say in the matter, it will stay empty forever. The story begins before my time, but I've read the records, I've seen the photographs, I've walked past that plot enough times to understand why the previous directors left it alone. In October of 1963, a man named Douglas Hendricks purchased Plot 22B for himself. He was 41 years old, unmarried, worked as an accountant at a local firm. According to the intake paperwork, he'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer and wanted to make his own arrangements while he was still capable. Practical, responsible, nothing unusual about that. Douglas paid in full, selected a simple casket, wrote out his own obituary, and left detailed instructions for his service. He wanted to be buried in Plot 22B specifically, said it had a good view of the mountains, that it felt peaceful. Our director at the time saw no reason to refuse. Douglas died 6 months later, in April of 1964. His funeral was scheduled for a Saturday morning. The casket was prepared, the plot was dug, the few attendees were notified. Everything was ready. Friday night, the night before the service, Douglas Hendricks disappeared, not his body. His body was in the casket in our chapel, embalmed and dressed, exactly where it was supposed to be. But sometime between the evening viewing and Saturday morning, Douglas Hendricks vanished from that casket. The chapel was locked. The building was secure. There were no signs of break-in, no evidence of disturbance. But when our staff arrived Saturday morning to prepare for the funeral, they found the casket open and empty. The clothes Douglas had been dressed in were still there, laid out neatly, as if someone had simply removed the body and left everything else behind. The police were called. An investigation was launched. Our entire staff was questioned, but no one could explain how a body could disappear from a locked building with no signs of forced entry. The case went cold within weeks. The funeral was canceled. Plot 22B remained empty. Douglas's family, what little there was, moved away. And our funeral home tried to move on, but Plot 22B didn't. I started working here in 1997, 33 years after Douglas disappeared. By then, the story had become something of a legend among the staff, the kind of tale you tell new employees to make them uneasy. I didn't believe it at first, thought it was exaggeration, urban legend, the kind of story that grows with each retelling. Then I found the boot prints. It was early spring, March or April, I can't remember exactly. I was doing a walkthrough of the grounds, checking on recent burials, making sure everything was maintained properly. That's when I noticed fresh prints in the mud On plot 22B, boot prints, large, probably a men's size 11 or 12. They came from the gravel path, crossed onto the empty plot, and stopped right in the center where a casket would have been lowered. Just stopped, no prints leading away, no prints circling back, just a single line of footsteps leading to the center of the plot, then nothing. I looked around, searching for an explanation. Maybe someone had walked there, then carefully stepped backward in their own prints to hide their exit. But the ground was soft from recent rain. Stepping backward would have disturbed the edges of the existing prints, made them messier. These prints were clean, deliberate, one way only. I took photographs, showed them to our groundskeeper. He had no explanation, said he'd check the cemetery each day to see if it happened again. 3 months later, it did. Same pattern. Fresh boot prints leading from the path to the center of plot 22B. Same size, same depth, same one-way trail. The groundskeeper had checked that plot the day before. It had been empty, no prints, no disturbance. But now they were there again. Over the following years, I documented every occurrence. The prints appeared roughly every 3 to 4 months, always the same pattern, always during a period when no one was supposed to be in the cemetery after dark. We installed security cameras in that section, but they never captured anyone walking onto the plot. The prints would simply appear between camera sweeps, materializing in the space of minutes with no one visible on the footage. I pulled Douglas Hendrix's file and examined the photographs from his intake appointment. There was one photo of him standing in our foyer, taken when he came to make his arrangements. He was wearing boots, work boots, well worn, probably size 11 or 12. I compared the tread pattern from that photograph to the prints on plot 22B. They matched. I should mention that I'm not someone who jumps to supernatural explanations. I believe in evidence, in rational thinking, in finding logical answers to strange questions. But the prints kept appearing, always the same, always leading to nowhere, and I couldn't explain them away. Other staff members started noticing patterns too. The prints only appeared on overcast days, never when the sun was bright. They only showed up in soft earth or mud, never on frozen ground or dry soil, and they were always fresh, not old prints that had somehow been preserved, but new prints with crisp edges and clear definition. It was like someone was walking to that plot regularly, checking on it, making sure it was still waiting. Last year, something changed. I arrived at work on a Monday morning in November to find our groundskeeper waiting for me in the parking lot. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly as he handed me his phone. "You need to see this," he said. The photograph on his screen showed plot 22B from that morning. The usual boot prints were there, leading to the center of the plot. But this time, there was something else. A disturbed patch of earth right in the center, like something had pushed up from below. Not a lot, just a slight mounding of soil, accompanied by what looked like handprints pressed into the dirt from underneath. We checked the plot together. The disturbance was real, the handprints visible in the soft earth. I measured them, photographed them from every angle. They were adult-sized, positioned as if someone had been lying beneath the soil and pressed upward with both palms. But plot 22B had never been used. There was no casket buried there, no vault, no body, just empty earth that had been sitting undisturbed for 60 years. I called in a ground penetrating radar company, told them I needed to verify that the plot was actually empty before we could sell it. They came out the following week, scanned the area thoroughly. The radar showed nothing, no vault, no coffin, no anomalies, just earth and rock layers, exactly what you'd expect from an unused plot. But the boot prints keep coming, and now, every few months, we find those handprints too, always pressed upward from below, always in the center of plot 22B. I've stopped trying to explain it, stopped showing the photographs to people who wouldn't understand. The plot stays empty, marked in our system as unavailable, and I tell inquiring families that the section isn't suitable for burial due to drainage issues. It's easier than telling them the truth that plot 22B is already occupied, has been since the night before Douglas Hendrix's funeral in 1964. He never made it to his own service, never got the burial he'd planned and paid for, but he keeps coming back, keeps walking to the center of that empty plot, keeps pressing upward from below, trying to claim what was supposed to be his. I don't know where Douglas Hendrix went the night he disappeared from his casket. Don't know how a body can vanish from a locked building and leave boot prints on its intended grave 60 years later. But I know plot 22B will never be sold because some people are still waiting for their funerals, and some graves are occupied long before the first body is lowered into them. I thought I understood death until the night I heard something that should have been impossible 6 feet beneath my shovel. My name is Marcus Cole, and I have worked as a gravedigger at Pinewood Cemetery in Boise, Idaho for the past 13 years. I've dug more graves than I can count, lowered more caskets than I care to remember, and filled in more burial sites than most people will ever see in their lifetime. Before last August, I thought I knew every sound a cemetery could make: wind through trees, rain on headstones, the settling of earth as it compresses over time. I was wrong. The burial that changed everything was scheduled for late afternoon on a Thursday. The deceased was a woman named Helen Pritchard, 89 years old, died peacefully in her sleep, according to the funeral director. Standard service, standard casket, standard everything. I'd prepared the grave that morning, a neat rectangular hole in the newer section of the cemetery, 6 feet deep like always, the walls straight and clean. The service was small, maybe 15 people, mostly elderly friends, and one middle-aged nephew who handled the arrangements. They said their goodbyes, the minister spoke his words, and the funeral director gave me the signal to begin lowering the casket after everyone had left. I operate the lowering device myself for smaller services. We only bring in the full crew for larger funerals. It's a simple mechanical system, straps and cranks that let you control the descent carefully. I've done it hundreds of times. The process is always the same. Position the casket over the grave, attach the straps, lower slowly until it reaches the bottom, remove the straps, begin backfilling. Everything went normally at first. The casket descended smoothly, touched the bottom of the grave with a soft thud, and I unhooked the straps and pulled them up. Then I grabbed my shovel and began the fill. That's when I heard it. Breathing. Not wind, not imagination. Breathing. Slow and rhythmic. In and out, in and out, coming from inside the grave. I stopped shoveling, stood completely still, listening. The sound continued for maybe 5 seconds, then stopped the moment I stopped moving. I waited, counted to 10, heard nothing but my own heartbeat and a crow calling from somewhere across the cemetery. I started shoveling again, dirt falling onto the casket lid, that familiar sound of earth covering wood, and the breathing started again, matching my rhythm, one breath for every 2 shovelfuls. In and out, slow, steady, deliberate. I stopped again. The breathing stopped. I looked around the cemetery, searching for any explanation. Maybe someone was nearby, standing behind a tree or headstone, their breathing carrying oddly across the open space. But I was alone. The funeral party had left. The funeral director had driven away, and the cemetery was empty except for me and the graves. I walked to the edge of the hole and looked down. The casket sat at the bottom, 6 feet below ground level, already covered by maybe 4 inches of dirt. Nothing moved, nothing looked disturbed, just a casket in a grave, exactly as it should be. But when I picked up my shovel and resumed filling, the breathing started again. This time I didn't stop. I kept shoveling, kept my pace steady, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe an echo effect from the hole, sound bouncing in weird ways. Maybe the air pressure changing as the grave filled, creating sounds that mimicked breathing. Maybe my own breath in the cold air, distorted and thrown back at me. But the breathing didn't sound like wind or pressure or echoes. It sounded like lungs filling and emptying, like someone taking slow, measured breaths, like someone sleeping peacefully 6 feet underground. I filled the grave faster than usual, my shovel biting into the pile of excavated earth and tossing it down with more force than necessary. The breathing continued the entire time, never speeding up, never slowing down, just maintaining that same calm rhythm that made my skin crawl. When the grave was half full, I stopped to catch my breath. My arms were burning, sweat dripping down my face, despite the cool August evening. The breathing stopped the moment I did. I stared down into the grave. 3 feet of earth now covered the casket. Whatever was making that sound, if anything was making that sound, was buried under 1,000 pounds of soil. There was no way breathing could carry through that much dirt. No way I should be able to hear it. But I had. I did. I finished the fill in silence, worked as fast as I could, not stopping, not listening, just shoveling until the grave was level with the surrounding ground. Then I packed the earth down with the back of my shovel, smoothed it over, and set up the temporary marker with Helen Pritchard's name. The entire time, I didn't hear breathing. As long as I kept moving, kept working, the sound didn't return. It was only in the stillness, in the pauses, that whatever was down there seemed to wake up and remember it needed air. I packed up my tools, loaded them in the truck, and drove to the maintenance thicket without looking back. I told myself I'd imagined it, told myself it was stress or fatigue or the power of suggestion. I'd been doing this job for 13 years. Maybe it was finally getting to me, making me hear things that weren't there. But the next day, I had another burial scheduled in the same section. Different grave, different deceased, but close enough to Helen Pritchard's site that I could see her fresh mound from where I was working. This burial was for a man named Peter Kowalski, 63 years old, heart attack. Same process. Lower the casket, remove the straps, begin the fill, and when I started shoveling, I heard it again, breathing, slow and rhythmic, coming from inside the grave. This time, I didn't stop to listen. I just kept shoveling, kept my pace steady, and tried to ignore the sound of lungs filling and emptying 6 feet beneath my boots. When I finished, I walked past Helen Pritchard's grave on my way back to the truck. I don't know why I did it. Curiosity, maybe, or stupidity. But I stood there beside her fresh mound and listened. The air was still, no wind, no birds, just silence. Then I heard it, faint, muffled by 6 feet of earth, but unmistakable, breathing. I reported it the next day, told my supervisor I'd heard strange sounds during the backfill, that maybe we should check the graves, make sure everything was sealed properly. He looked at me like I was losing my mind. Sounds, he said. What kind of sounds? I couldn't tell him the truth. Couldn't say I'd heard breathing coming from sealed caskets buried under 6 feet of dirt. So I told him I'd heard creaking, maybe settling wood, something that didn't seem right. He sent another digger to check. The graves were fine, no disturbances, no settling, no problems. Everything was exactly as it should be. But I know what I heard, and when I was assigned to dig another grave in that section a week later, I refused. I told my supervisor I had a bad back, that I needed to work in different terrain for a while. He reassigned me to the older section on the other side of the cemetery, where the ground is harder and the graves are more spread out. I've been working there ever since, haven't set foot in the newer section in over a year. Other diggers handle those plots now, and I don't ask them if they've heard anything strange, because I know if they have, they won't admit it, won't want to seem crazy or superstitious. They'll just keep shoveling, keep filling, keep ignoring the sound of breathing that comes from places where breathing shouldn't be possible. I've learned that some sounds aren't meant to be acknowledged. Some things you hear are better left unconfirmed, and some sections of a cemetery carry secrets that are better left buried. Helen Pritchard's grave is still there, near the maple tree in the newer section. I drive past it sometimes on my way to other areas of the cemetery. I never stop to listen anymore, because I already know what I'd hear, and knowing is enough. The shift was routine until I saw someone I'd buried 3 years ago kneeling beside her husband's grave. My name is Thomas Sayers, and I have worked as a mortician at Clearwater Memorial Chapel in Salem, Oregon for 34 years. In that time, I have prepared thousands of bodies for their final rest, coordinated countless services, and become familiar with the routines of regular mourners who visit our cemetery. Before 2019, I thought I understood the relationship between the living and the dead, between memory and presence. I was wrong. Her name was Dorothy Brennan, though everyone called her Dot. I first met her in 1997 when we handled the funeral for her husband, Robert. He'd been 72, a retired machinist, died of emphysema after a lifetime of smoking. The service was modest, attended by maybe 30 people, and Dot sat in the front row wearing a blue dress, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed but devastated. After we buried Robert in Plot 47, Section C, Dot began a ritual that would continue for the next 22 years. Every morning at 8 o'clock, she would arrive at the cemetery, walk to her husband's grave, and kneel there for exactly 15 minutes. Rain or shine, summer or winter, she never missed a day. I'd see her through the chapel windows as I prepared the building for morning viewings, this small woman in her blue dress, kneeling beside that granite headstone like she was keeping an appointment and she couldn't break. We spoke occasionally over the years. Nothing deep, just pleasantries and acknowledgments. She'd nod at me when she arrived, and I'd nod back, respecting her need for privacy. Sometimes she'd bring flowers, usually white roses. Other times she'd just kneel there, her lips moving in conversation with someone only she could see. I grew to admire her dedication. In a world where grief often fades or evolves, Dot's remained constant. She never remarried, never seemed to consider moving on. Robert had been her world, and even in death, he remained at the center of it. In July of 2019, Dot stopped coming. I noticed her absence immediately. After 22 years of clockwork visits, the cemetery felt strange without her presence at 8 in the morning. I checked with our office staff, wondering if perhaps she'd changed her schedule or was dealing with an illness. 3 days later, her daughter called. Dot had died in her sleep, peacefully, her heart simply giving out. The daughter asked if we could handle the arrangements, said her mother would have wanted it that way. We'd been taking care of Robert for decades, after all. It only made sense. I prepared Dorothy Brennan myself, dressed her in her blue dress, the same one she'd worn every day to visit Robert, styled her white hair the way she'd always kept it, neat and proper, made sure her hands were positioned just right, folded over her chest the way she'd folded them in life when she knelt beside that grave. The funeral was small. Dot had outlived most of her friends, and her family had scattered across the country. Maybe 15 people came to say goodbye. We buried her in Plot 48, Section C, right next to Robert. The way it should have been. I thought that would be the end of the story. A love story, really, about devotion that lasted beyond death. But that's not where it ended. 2 weeks after Dot's funeral, I arrived at the chapel early as usual. Around 7:30 in the morning, I was preparing for a viewing scheduled for 9, arranging flowers in the main room when I glanced out the window towards Section C. Someone was kneeling at Robert Brennan's grave. A woman in a blue dress, her white hair catching the early morning light, her posture familiar in a way that made my breath catch. I stood there for a long moment, staring. Dot had a daughter, I reminded myself maybe she'd come to visit both graves, was stopping at her father's first, but the resemblance was uncanny. The exact shade of blue, the exact style of dress, the exact way of kneeling with her back straight and her hands folded. I walked outside, crossing the dew-wet grass toward Section C. The morning was quiet, just bird song and the distant hum of traffic. As I got closer, I could see the woman more clearly, or thought I could. She seemed slightly out of focus, like she was standing in fog even though the morning was clear. "Excuse me," I called out, still maybe 20 feet away. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me at all, just remained kneeling, her head bowed, her lips moving in what looked like a conversation. I got within 10 feet, 5 feet, and then I smelled it. Lavender. Dot's perfume. She'd worn it every day, a light floral scent that I'd come to associate with those morning visits. It hung in the air around Robert's grave, impossible to ignore. "Dot," I said, even though I knew it was impossible. The figure began to fade, not quickly, not dramatically, just a gradual dispersal, like morning mist burning off under the sun. Within seconds, she was gone, but the perfume remained, hanging in the air around that grave, proof that something had been there. I checked Dot's grave, right next to Robert's. The flowers we'd placed during her service were still fresh, undisturbed. The earth was settled, no sign that anyone had walked across it. But at Robert's grave, the grass was pressed down in a pattern I recognized, the shape of someone kneeling, the exact position Dot had occupied for 22 years. I told myself I'd imagined it. Morning light playing tricks, memory creating shapes out of shadows. I went back to the chapel and continued preparing for the day's viewing. But the next morning, she was there again, same time, same place, same blue dress, kneeling at Robert's grave with her back straight and her hands folded. This time, I didn't approach. I just watched from the chapel window as she knelt there for exactly 15 minutes, then faded away like smoke, leaving behind only that lavender scent. It's been 3 years now. Dot appears most mornings, though not every morning. I've learned to recognize the pattern. She comes when the air is still, when the cemetery is quiet, when there's that particular quality of light that makes everything seem suspended between worlds. Other staff members have seen her too, though most won't talk about it. Our groundskeeper mentioned once that he'd seen a woman in blue near Section C, but when he went to greet her, she vanished. One of our funeral directors asked me if I knew who kept leaving the scent of lavender near the Brennan plots. I told her it was probably flowers from a nearby grave, even though I knew it wasn't. I've stopped trying to explain it, stopped trying to rationalize or justify or understand. Some things, I've learned, exist beyond explanation. Some love is strong enough to overcome death, persistent enough to establish new routines even after the body has been buried. Dorothy Brennan visits her husband every morning at 8 o'clock. She wears her blue dress, kneels at his grave, and spends exactly 15 minutes in conversation with the man she loved for 50 years. Then she fades away, back to wherever she goes when she's not here. I never approach her anymore, never try to speak to her or confirm what I'm seeing. I just acknowledge her presence the way I did when she was alive, with a simple nod, a gesture of respect for her dedication, because I've learned that death doesn't end all routines. Some appointments are kept regardless of mortality, and some mourners refuse to let a little thing like their own death interrupt their daily visits. Dot Brennan died in 2019, and I buried her myself in Plot 48, Section C. Her body is in the ground, 6 feet under, sealed and still, but every morning, weather permitting, she kneels beside her husband's grave in her blue dress. And every morning, the scent of lavender hangs in the air around Plot 47. Some habits, I've learned, are stronger than death. Some, love doesn't need a living body to maintain its vigil. And some goodbyes are never quite final. I never should have tried to fix something that didn't want to stay fixed, but after 18 years of maintenance work, I thought I could solve any problem. My name is Michael Tran, and I have worked as a maintenance supervisor at Seaside Memorial Gardens in Astoria, Oregon, for nearly 2 decades. I maintain the grounds, repair damaged monuments, reset headstones that have shifted over time, and generally keep the cemetery in proper condition. I understand soil erosion, ground settling, the effects of freeze thaw cycles on stone and earth. Before last year, I thought every maintenance issue had a logical cause and a practical solution. I was wrong. Grave 88 sits in the oldest section of the cemetery, near the back corner where the land slopes gently toward the Columbia River. The headstone belongs to a man named Samuel Garrett, 1923 to 1952. The inscription is simple: his name, his dates, and a single line beneath: "Lost to the sea, may his course be true." I first noticed the problem during a routine inspection last March. The headstone was tilted, not dramatically, not enough that a casual visitor would necessarily notice, but enough that my trained eye caught it immediately. 3 degrees to the left, angled us from its proper perpendicular position. I made a note to reset it. Headstones shift over time. It's normal, especially in older sections where the ground has been settling for decades. Tree roots, water movement, soil compression, they all contribute to monuments gradually moving out of alignment. Usually it's a simple fix: excavate around the base, re-level, reinforce if necessary. I came back the next day with my tools and reset Samuel Garrett's headstone. It was a straightforward job. The foundation was solid, no cracks or damage, no obvious reason for the tilt. I leveled it carefully, made sure it was perfectly perpendicular, packed the soil around the base, and checked my work with a spirit level. Perfect, exactly 90 degrees, properly aligned with the surrounding stones. The next morning, it was tilted again, 3 degrees to the left, exactly the same angle as before. I assumed my repair hadn't been thorough enough. Maybe the soil hadn't been packed correctly. Maybe there was water movement I hadn't accounted for. I reset the stone again, this time digging deeper, adding gravel for better drainage, really making sure the foundation was secure. 24 hours later, tilted 3 degrees to the left. I started documenting each reset, photographed the stone from multiple angles, measured the tilt with precision instruments, recorded the exact position. Every morning, the stone was 3 degrees off. Every time I fixed it, it stayed level for approximately 18 to 20 hours, then shifted overnight back to that same angle. After 2 weeks of this, I brought in a structural engineer. Maybe there was something wrong with the ground beneath the monument, some subsurface issue causing consistent movement. The engineer surveyed the area, tested the soil, examined the foundation. Everything was fine. Stable ground, solid base, no geological issues. He had no explanation for why the headstone kept tilting. I tried different approaches. Reset the stone with concrete, installed metal reinforcement bars, even excavated the entire foundation and rebuilt it from scratch with modern materials. Nothing worked. Every morning, 3 degrees to the left. That's when I started researching Samuel Garrett's history. The records at the County Historical Society were sparse but informative. Samuel had been a commercial fisherman working out of Astoria his entire adult life. In May of 1952, his boat went down during a storm off the coast. The boat was found days later, capsized, but Samuel's body was never recovered. His family had buried an empty casket, a memorial service for a man who'd been claimed by the Pacific. The inscription made more sense after that. Lost to the sea, may his course be true. It was a sailor's prayer, a hope that even in death he might find his way. I pulled up a compass and checked the headstone's orientation when it was tilted. 3 degrees to the left put it pointing almost exactly west-northwest, toward the ocean, toward the direction Samuel's boat had gone down. When I reset the stone to perpendicular, it faced due north, the standard orientation for that section of the cemetery. But overnight, it would shift west-northwest, toward the sea. I told myself it was a coincidence. Ground movement, water flow, something logical causing the stone to tilt in that specific direction. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Samuel Garrett's headstone was trying to point somewhere, trying to orient itself towards something it needed to face. I stopped resetting it after that. Left the stone tilted 3 degrees to the left, pointing toward the ocean where Samuel had died 70 years earlier. For 3 days, it stayed exactly as it was. No further movement, no additional tilting, just 3 degrees off, locked in that position. Then I received a complaint from a family member who'd visited the grave. They'd noticed the tilt, thought it looked neglected, asked why we weren't maintaining the cemetery properly. I had to explain that we were monitoring the stone, that we'd identified structural issues we were working to resolve. So I reset it again, leveled it perfectly, documented the work, and waited. The next morning, 3 degrees to the left. But this time, there was something else. When I approached the grave to check the tilt, I noticed the grass around the headstone was disturbed, not trampled like someone had walked there, but pushed down in a pattern, like something had moved across it. Long, sweeping marks that curved around the base of the stone, originating from the direction of the river and circling the grave before disappearing back toward the water. I checked the cemetery's security footage. We have cameras covering most of the grounds, installed after vandalism issues a few years back. The camera that covered that section showed nothing unusual, just the headstone sitting there, then shifting slightly between frames, one frame level, the next frame tilted, with nothing visible causing the movement. But in the grass, in the early morning dew before the sun burned it off, you could see the tracks. Something had been there, something that left marks in the grass but didn't appear on camera. I consulted with other cemetery maintenance workers, people I'd known for years who dealt with unusual situations. Most of them just shrugged, told me to let the stone sit tilted if it wasn't hurting anything. One older worker, a man who'd been in the business for 40 years, took me aside. Some graves don't want to be fixed, he said quietly. Some of the dead, they're not settled. They're still trying to go somewhere, still looking for something. Best to let them point where they want to point. I've stopped resetting Samuel Garrett's headstone. It sits 3 degrees off perpendicular, pointing west-northwest toward the Pacific Ocean, toward the place where a commercial fishing boat went down in 1952 and claimed a sailor who was never recovered. The complaints have stopped. No more families mentioning the tilt. It's like they don't see it anymore, or maybe they've just accepted that this one grave is different from the others. Every few months, I check on it. The tilt remains exactly the same, 3 degrees to the left, locked in that position. And sometimes, early in the morning, when the dew is still on the grass, I see those tracks again. Long sweeping marks curving around the base of the stone, originating from the river, circling the grave like something is checking on it, making sure it's still pointed in the right direction. I've learned that some monuments aren't meant to face the same direction as their neighbors. Some headstones serve as compasses, pointing not to north or south, but to places that matter more than cardinal directions. Samuel Garrett drowned facing north, pulled under by currents he couldn't fight. But his stone points west-northwest, toward home waters, toward the fishing grounds he knew better than his own backyard. I don't know if it's the earth settling or something else moving that stone. Don't know if it's geology or the memory of a sailor still trying to find his course. But I know that Grave 88 sits 3 degrees off perpendicular, and it's going to stay that way. Because some headstones aren't marking where someone is buried, they're marking where someone is trying to return. And Samuel Garrett, lost to the sea in 1952, is still navigating toward home. I never should have checked the security footage, but after the chair mowed for the 7th time, I needed to know what was happening when I wasn't watching. My name is Iris Caldwell, and I have worked as a chapel attendant at Westbrook Funeral Home in Eugene, Oregon for the past 9 years. I set up viewing rooms, arrange seating, coordinate flowers and memorial displays, and ensure that every family has a dignified space to say goodbye. I've set up thousands of rooms in my time here, worked with every possible configuration and request. Before this past winter, I thought I understood every aspect of my job. I was wrong. Chapel Room 4 is our smallest viewing space, designed for intimate services with the limited attendance. It holds maybe 20 people comfortably, with rows of padded chairs arranged facing a raised platform where we position the casket. The room has soft lighting, cream colored walls, and a single stained glass window that catches the afternoon sun. It's peaceful, appropriate. Nothing about the room itself suggests anything unusual. The first time I noticed the chair had moved, I assumed I'd made a mistake during setup. It was a Wednesday morning in late November, and I was preparing room 4 for a 2 o'clock viewing. The deceased was an elderly woman named Margaret Walsh, quiet service, maybe 15 expected attendees. I'd arranged the chairs in 4 rows of 5, standard configuration, all facing the casket at proper distances. I left the room at 11:30 to help with another service. When I returned at 1:15 to do a final check, one chair from the front row had been moved. Not dramatically, just shifted forward about 8 inches, closer to the casket than the others. I pushed it back into alignment, assuming I'd positioned it incorrectly the first time. Did my final check, made sure everything was perfect, and opened the doors for the family at 2 o'clock. The service went normally, nothing unusual. The next day, I had another viewing in room 4. Different family, different deceased, same setup process. I arranged the chairs, left for lunch, came back to find one chair moved forward. Front row, center position, about 8 inches closer to the casket than it should have been. This time, I was certain I hadn't made a mistake. I specifically remembered arranging that front row, making sure each chair was perfectly aligned. I'd even used tape marks on the floor to ensure consistent spacing. I moved the chair back, made a note in my logbook, and mentioned it to our facilities manager. He said it was probably cleaning staff accidentally bumping the chairs when they vacuumed. Made sense. Simple explanation. Except the chair kept moving. Every single viewing in room 4, without exception, resulted in the same thing. One chair from the front row, usually center or just left of center, moved approximately 8 inches closer to the casket. It happened when the room was locked between setup and service. It happened after I'd checked and double-checked the arrangement. It happened regardless of which family was being served or what time of day the viewing took place. After 2 weeks of this, I started marking the exact chair positions with tape on the floor, measured distances, documented everything, took photographs before I left the room. The chair still moved. Same distance every time, always forward, always when the room was supposedly empty. The facilities manager checked the room thoroughly. No structural issues, no sloping floor that might cause furniture to slide, no ventilation system strong enough to move a chair. He was as puzzled as I was. That's when I asked to review the security footage. We have cameras in all the viewing rooms, discreetly positioned for security purposes. The footage is stored for 30 days before being overwritten. I pulled up recordings from room 4, specifically the time periods between my setup and the viewings when the room was locked and empty. The first recording I watched was from a Tuesday afternoon service. I fast forwarded to the relevant time period, room empty, chairs arranged perfectly, everything in place. I watched at normal speed, then double speed, looking for any movement. At 2:23 p.m., 40 minutes before the viewing was scheduled to begin, it happened. The chair moved, not quickly, not dramatically. It simply slid forward across the carpet, 8 inches exactly, moving in a straight line toward the casket. The motion was smooth, deliberate, like someone had pushed it, except there was no one there. The room was empty, locked, completely undisturbed except for that single chair gliding forward. There was no sound on the footage. Our cameras don't have audio, but watching that chair move in total set of silence across an empty room made my skin crawl in a way I hadn't experienced before. I watched more recordings. Every single viewing in room 4 showed the same thing. Between setup and service, when the room was locked and empty, one chair would slide forward. Always from the front row, always 8 inches, always moving smoothly as if being pushed by invisible hands. I showed the footage to our funeral director. He watched it 3 times without speaking, his expression growing more troubled with each viewing. Finally, he asked me to research the history of Room 4, see if there was anything in our records that might explain this. I spent a week going through old files, talking to longtime staff members, checking obituaries and service records. Most of it was routine, hundreds of services over the years, nothing unusual. But then I found a note in a file from 1987, written by a chapel attendant who'd worked here before I was hired. The note was brief. Room 4 consistently receives requests from family members to move front row seating closer during services. Consider permanent repositioning. I talked to that former attendant, tracked her down through our alumni records. She was retired now, living in Portland, but she remembered room 4 clearly. There was always someone who wanted to be closer, she told me over the phone. Every single service, without fail, at least one family member would ask us to move their chair forward. They'd say they couldn't see properly, or they wanted to be nearer to their loved one. It happened so consistently that we started positioning the front row closer by default. Did you ever notice the chairs moving on their own? I asked. There was a long pause. Why do you ask? I told her about the security footage. Another pause, longer this time. I never saw it on camera, she said finally, but I always felt like someone else was in that room, someone who wanted to be close, who couldn't stand being far away. I assumed it was grief, the emotions of the families affecting the space, but maybe it was something else. I've stopped trying to fix the chair. Now, when I set up room 4, I position the front row 8 inches closer than standard. It seems to satisfy whatever is moving that chair, because it hasn't shifted since I made the adjustment. The security footage still shows something strange, though. Even with the chairs positioned closer, if I leave the room during setup, the footage sometimes catches movement. Not the chairs this time, but shadows. Brief flickers of darkness that pass between the seats and the casket, like someone walking through the room even though no one is there. The funeral director has stopped questioning it. The families never notice anything unusual, and I've learned to accept that room 4 has a permanent occupant, someone who attends every service, who always wants to be in the front row, 8 inches closer than everyone else. I don't know who they are. Don't know if it's someone who was viewed in that room years ago and never left, or something else entirely. But I know they're there, and I know they want to be close. So I set up the chairs accordingly, and I don't ask questions. Because some mourners, I've learned, never leave the funeral home. Some grief is permanent enough to establish residence, and some attendees will always move closer, whether they're visible or not. Every cemetery has a rule we don't talk about. Ours is simple: never disturb grave 31, even when something appears there that shouldn't exist. My name is Eleanor Voss, and I have served as cemetery manager at Highland Rest Cemetery in Corvallis, Oregon, for the past 23 years. I maintain records, coordinate burials, oversee grounds maintenance, and ensure that our cemetery operates with dignity and respect for both the deceased and their families. I thought I understood every grave in our 140 acres, every burial dating back to our founding in 1912. I was wrong about grave 31. The grave belongs to a man named Walter Finch, 1902 to 1955. According to our records, he was a bachelor, no children, no close family. He worked as a bank clerk his entire adult life, lived alone in a boarding house downtown, and died quietly of heart failure at age 53. His funeral was arranged by the bank where he worked, attended by maybe 6 colleagues, and he was buried in grave 31 on a Wednesday afternoon in August of 1955. The grave was never opened after that. No spouse added later, no family members buried nearby, no reason to ever disturb the site. It sat undisturbed for 67 years, a simple granite marker in the older section, occasionally visited by historians interested in the cemetery's early plots, but otherwise forgotten. Until last month. I was doing my usual Monday morning walkthrough, checking for any weekend damage or issues that needed attention. The weather had been clear, no storms or vandalism concerns, just routine inspection. I walked through the older section, noting a few headstones that needed cleaning, some grass that needed trimming around the edges. That's when I saw it on grave 31. A toy truck, small, maybe 4 inches long, made of die-cast metal, painted red. It was positioned carefully on top of the flat granite marker, right in the center, like someone had deliberately placed it there as an offering. My first thought was that a child had left it, maybe playing in the cemetery and abandoning their toy. It happens occasionally, but something about the truck bothered me. It looked old, well used, the paint worn in places, the wheels dirty, but still functional. Not a modern toy that a child would be playing with today. I picked it up, examined it more closely. On the bottom of the truck was a manufacturer's mark and a date, 1972. The truck was nearly 50 years old. I checked Walter Finch's records again when I got back to my office. No children, no known relatives, no one who would have reason to leave a toy on his grave. And even if someone had left it, why a toy from 1972? Walter had died in 1955, 17 years before this truck was even manufactured. I set the truck on my desk, planning to dispose of it properly, but something made me hesitate. Instead, I photographed it, documented where I'd found it, and filed it away in our lost and found box. 2 weeks later, another toy appeared on Grave 31. This time it was a small metal car, also die cast, also painted red, also clearly old and well used. I checked the manufacturer's mark, 1974. I started keeping watch on that section of the cemetery. Checked Grave 31 every morning, sometimes twice a day, trying to catch whoever was leaving these toys. But I never saw anyone approach the grave. No visitors, no children playing nearby, no sign of who was caking these offerings. The toys kept appearing, always small vehicles, trucks, cars, a tiny metal airplane, always red, always manufactured in the 1970s, always placed carefully in the center of Walter Finch's marker, like someone was building a collection for him. I installed a motion activated camera focused on that section, hidden in a nearby tree. The camera would trigger whenever something moved within its field of view, capturing photographs every few seconds. I checked the footage religiously, looking for whoever was leaving these toys. The camera captured nothing. No people, no animals large enough to carry toys, no movement except wind-blown leaves and passing shadows. But the toys kept appearing, usually overnight, sometimes appearing even during the day between my inspection rounds. I researched Walter Finch more thoroughly, found census records, employment documents, boarding house registries. Everything confirmed what our burial records stated. He was a bachelor, no children, lived alone his entire life. Quiet man, kept to himself, no hobbies or interests that anyone remembered. But I also found something else. A newspaper article from 1954, 1 year before Walter died. A human interest piece about volunteers at the local children's hospital. Walter Finch was mentioned briefly. He'd been volunteering in the pediatric ward for several years, reading to sick children, playing WOMs with them, bringing them small gifts to brighten their days. One of the doctors quoted in the article said, "Mr. Finch has a special fondness for the children in long-term care. He brings them toy cars and trucks, always red, because he says red is a happy color. The children adore him." I sat in my office reading that article over and over, looking at the collection of red toy vehicles I'd gathered from Grave 31. All of them dated from the 1970s, 15 to 20 years after Walter died. I started researching the children who'd been in that hospital during the 50s, found obituaries, memorial records, heartbreaking stories of children who died from illnesses that modern medicine could now cure. Many of them had died in the late 50s, 60s, and 70s. Some of them were buried in Highland Rest Cemetery, in the children's section on the opposite side of the grounds from Grave 31. I mapped their graves, noted their death dates. Then I compared those dates to when the toys on Walter's grave had been manufactured. Every single toy corresponded to a year when one of those children had died. A 1972 truck appeared the 3 weeks after I'd found an obituary for a boy named Timothy Ross. Died in 1972 at age 8. Had been a patient in the pediatric ward in the early 50s. A 1974 car appeared shortly after I documented the death of a girl named Sarah Chen. Died in 1974 at age 10, also a former pediatric patient during Walter's volunteering years. The children Walter had known, the ones he'd brought red toy vehicles to when they were sick, were returning those toys to him. Years after their own deaths, decades after his, they were leaving offerings on his grave. I stopped collecting the toys after that, started leaving them where they appeared, arranged carefully on Walter Finch's marker. The collection has grown steadily over the past month. 15 toys now, all red, all from the 70s and 80s, all corresponding to children who died years after Walter did, but who remembered him from their time in that hospital. Our groundskeepers have learned not to disturb them. When it rains, the toys stay dry somehow, the water seeming to slide around them. When wind blows, they remain in place, never scattered or knocked over. Last week, I found a small note tucked under one of the trucks. The paper was old, yellowed, the handwriting childish but careful. Thank you for the red cars. I still have mine. Timothy. Timothy Ross died in 1972. His grave is in the children's section, marked with a small headstone that shows a boy of 8 years old. But somehow, 50 years after his death, he'd left a note for Walter Finch. I filed the note with the photographs and documentation I've been keeping. Didn't show it to anyone, didn't try to explain it. Some things, I've learned, exist beyond explanation. Grave 31 was never opened after 1955. Walter Finch has been resting there undisturbed for nearly 70 years, but his grave is visited regularly now by children who died decades after he did, who remember a quiet bachelor who brought them red toy cars when they were sick and scared and facing the end of their short lives. The toys keep appearing, the collection keeps growing, and I've learned that some gifts create bonds strong enough to outlast both the giver and the receiver. Walter Finch had no children of his own, but he has children visiting him now, leaving him offerings, thanking him for kindnesses shown so long ago that only they remember. Some debts, I've learned, are repaid across decades. Some gratitude persists beyond death, and some graves are visited by those who were never born to the deceased, but who loved them anyway. I thought I understood death until I met someone who was waiting for his own funeral at every service I coordinated. My name is Daniel Paulson, and I have worked as a funeral greeter at Maplewood Memorial Chapel in Portland, Oregon for the past 16 years. My job is simple: welcome families as they arrive, guide them to the appropriate viewing rooms or chapel spaces, ensure they have everything they need during their time of grief. I've greeted thousands of mourners over the years, learned to recognize the different shapes grief takes, the various ways people say goodbye. Before last year, I thought I'd seen every type of funeral attendee. I was wrong, I first noticed him at a service in late January. The deceased was a woman named Patricia Morrison, 74 years old, breast cancer, survived by 3 adult children and 7 grandchildren. The chapel was full, maybe 80 people, standing room only. I was positioned near the entrance, helping late arrivals find seats, when I saw him standing in the back corner, a man in a gray coat, long, like an old-fashioned overcoat, the kind you don't see much anymore. He was maybe 60 years old, though his face had a quality that made it hard to determine his exact age. Dark hair graying at the temples, clean shaven, unremarkable features. He stood perfectly still, hands folded in front of him, watching the service with an expression of polite attention. I assumed he was family, perhaps a distant relative or old friend. After the service ended and people began filing out, I looked for him to offer condolences or ask if he needed anything, but he was gone. I'd been watching the exit and I hadn't seen him leave. The next week, we had a service for a man named Robert Chen, 63 years old, heart attack. Completely different family, different circumstances, different attendees. I was greeting people as they arrived when I saw him again. The same man, the same gray coat, standing in the back corner of the chapel, hands folded, watching with that same polite attention. This time I made a point to speak with him after the service. I approached while he was still standing in his corner spot, before he could disappear like last time. "Excuse me," I said. "I'm Daniel, one of the greeters here. I wanted to make sure you're doing all right. See if there's anything you need." He looked at me with eyes that were a pale gray, almost colorless. "I'm fine, thank you. Were you a friend of Mr. Chen's?" "No." He said it simply, without elaboration. "Family?" "No." I waited for him to explain, but he didn't. Just stood there, watching me with those pale eyes, his expression neutral. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you attending the service? I didn't see your name on the guest registry." "I never sign in," he said. "I'm just observing." It was an odd thing to say, but grief makes people respond in unusual ways, so I didn't push. I offered my condolences, asked again if he needed anything, and left, him alone. Over the following months, I saw him at every funeral. Not every single one. We typically host 4 or 5 services per week, but frequently enough that I started looking for him. The gray coat became familiar, his back corner position predictable. He attended services for young and old, for people who died suddenly, and people who'd been ill for years. He never signed the guest book, never spoke to the families, never explained his presence. Other staff members noticed him too. Our funeral directors mentioned the man who came to multiple services but never seemed connected to any of the deceased. Our chapel coordinator asked if he was perhaps a grief counselor or social worker who attended services professionally, but he never introduced himself, never carried in any identification or credentials. I started documenting his appearances, kept a private log of which services he attended, trying to find a pattern. There wasn't one. Different ages, different causes of death, different families. The only consistency was his presence, always in the back, always in the gray coat, always watching. After 6 months of seeing him, I decided to be direct. It was a Tuesday afternoon service for a teenage girl who died in a car accident. The chapel was packed with grieving classmates and devastated parents. I saw him in his usual position and walked over before the service began. "I've seen you at many services here," I said quietly. "I'm starting to wonder if you need help with something. Are you looking for a particular person? A lost family member?" He studied me for a long moment. "No." "Then why do you keep coming?" "I'm waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For mine." The way he said it made something cold settle in my chest. "Your what?" "My funeral." He said it calmly, matter of factly, like he was discussing the weather. "I'm waiting for my funeral." I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. "I don't understand." "I will," he said. "Eventually. I just don't know when. So I come to these to see what they're like, to understand what's waiting." "Are you ill?" I asked carefully. "Is there something—" "No." He shook his head. "Nothing like that. I'm just waiting, have been for a long time." "How long?" He didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the window, pointing out across the cemetery grounds to a section of empty plots near the eastern edge. "That's where mine will be, plot 73. I've been watching it for years." I knew the cemetery layout well. Plot 73 was in a newer section, not yet fully developed. I made a mental note to check the records after the service. "How do you know that's your plot?" I asked. "The same way you know when something belongs to you," he said. "You just know." The service began, and our conversation ended. I took my position near the entrance, but I kept glancing back at him. He stood perfectly still, watching the ceremony with that same polite attention, like he was taking notes for future reference. After the service, I went straight to our records office, pulled up the plot map for the eastern section, found plot 73. According to our system, it had never been sold. No purchase record, no reservation, no name associated with it. Just an empty plot waiting for a buyer. I checked obituaries, death records, anything that might connect to a man matching his description. Found nothing. No one who fit his appearance. No one who'd expressed interest in that specific plot. The next funeral he attended, I tried to photograph him, just a quick snapshot with my phone, thinking I could show it to other staff members, maybe find someone who recognized him. But when I reviewed the photo, he wasn't in it. The back corner of the chapel was empty, even though I'd been looking directly at him when I took the picture. I've stopped trying to understand. He still appears at services, maybe once or twice a week, always in the gray coat, always in the back corner. Other staff members see him too, confirm his presence, but no one else seems as bothered by it as I am. Last month, I walked out to plot 73 during my lunch break, stood there looking at the empty earth, trying to understand what he sees when he points to that spot. The grass was neat, well maintained, unremarkable, just an unsold plot in a developing section. But there was something about the space that felt occupied, like it was waiting, like it had been waiting for a long time. I don't know who the man in the gray coat is. don't know if he's someone preparing for his own death, someone with a premonition, or something else entirely. But I know he's been attending funerals at Maplewood Memorial Chapel for at least a year, probably longer. And I know he's waiting for his own service in Plot 73. I've learned that some mourners aren't grieving the dead. They're rehearsing for their own end, attending services like someone might visit a venue before their own performance. The man in the gray coat is waiting, watching, learning. And someday, I suspect, Plot 73 will finally have a name. I just hope I'm not the one greeting guests at that particular service, because I've learned that some attendees aren't there to honor the deceased. They're there to preview their own goodbye. I never should have reviewed the overnight footage, but the motion sensor had been triggering in the mausoleum for 3 nights straight, and I needed to know why. My name is Kenneth Briggs, and I have worked as a security systems technician for Riverside Cemetery in Salem, Oregon for the past 12 years. I install cameras, maintain monitoring equipment, review footage when issues arise, and ensure that our security infrastructure operates properly across 120 acres of cemetery grounds. I understand motion sensors, infrared cameras, heat signatures, and digital surveillance. Before last month, I thought I could explain any anomaly that appeared on our recordings. I was wrong. The mausoleum sits at the north edge of the property, a limestone building constructed in 1923 that houses 240 crypts arranged in walls on 3 floors. It's climate controlled, well maintained, and equipped with state of the art security, including 6 high definition cameras with infrared capability for night recording. The building is locked every evening at 6 o'clock and opened at 8 the next morning. No one is supposed to be inside during those hours. But for 3 consecutive nights in early October, the motion sensors had been triggering around 2 in the morning. Each time, it was the same sensor, positioned in the east corridor on the 2nd floor, covering crypts 12 through 24. Each time, the alert would last for approximately 6 hours, then stop just before sunrise. The cemetery director asked me to review the footage and determine what was setting off the sensor. Probably an animal that had gotten inside, maybe a malfunction in the sensor itself. Routine investigation. I pulled up the recordings from the first night and started reviewing. The footage showed the east corridor from an elevated angle, infrared mode, rendering everything in shades of gray and white. The crypts appeared as dark rectangles in the wall, the marble facings showing cooler than the surrounding limestone. The corridor was empty, undisturbed. At 2:07 in the morning, the motion sensor triggered. I watched carefully, looking for what had activated it. At first, I saw nothing. The corridor looked exactly the same as it had before the trigger. But then I noticed something odd. In front of Crypt 17, there was a dark spot. Not a shadow exactly, but a space where the infrared showed cold, significantly colder than the surrounding air, appearing on the thermal imaging as a dark, human-shaped outline against the lighter background. I rewound and watched again. The cold spot appeared between frames, materializing in front of Crypt 17 at exactly 2:07. It was person-sized, maybe 5'9" or 5'10", standing upright directly in front of the crypt face. And it didn't move. I fast-forwarded through the footage. 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 4, 5, 6. The cold spot remained in the same position for the entire time, standing motionless in front of Crypt 17, showing as a distinctly colder temperature than anything else in the corridor. At 7:53, just minutes before the building was unlocked for the day, the cold spot vanished. One frame and it was there, the next frame it was gone. I checked the footage from the second and third nights. Same pattern. Cold spot appearing at 2:07, standing in front of Crypt 17, disappearing just before 8 in the morning. Never moving, never changing position, just standing there for 6 hours, radiating cold. I looked up the records for Crypt 17. It belonged to a man named Vincent Marsh, 1941 to 1998. He'd been entombed there after dying in a house fire, one of 3 victims in a residential blaze that had made local news at the time. According to the notes, his crypt had been permanently sealed with additional welding work after the entombment due to family concerns about the condition of the remains. The seal had never been opened since. I decided to inspect the crypt in person, took my thermal camera and tools, went to the mausoleum during afternoon hours when the building was open. The east corridor looked normal in daylight, just a quiet hallway with crypts lining both walls, marble facings polished and maintained, small flower vases at some of the sites. Crypt 17 appeared undisturbed. The marble facing was clean, Vincent Marsh's name and dates engraved clearly. I checked the seal, expecting to find it intact like the records indicated. It wasn't. The marble facing was slightly ajar, maybe a quarter-inch gap between the stone and the frame. Not enough to be obvious from a distance, but close up, I could see the separation. I could feel cold air coming from inside the crypt, considerably colder than the climate-controlled corridor. I examined the seal more carefully. The welding work that had been done in 1998 was broken, not cut from the outside, but broken from within. The metal showed stress fractures and displacement consistent with pressure applied from inside the crypt, pushing outward. I reported this immediately. The cemetery director called the family, explained the situation, suggested we needed to inspect the crypt to ensure structural integrity. The family agreed, concerned about potential damage to their father's remains. We opened Crypt 17 the following day. Proper procedures, respectful handling, everything documented. The casket inside was intact, sealed, showing no signs of disturbance. Vincent Marsh's remains were undisturbed, exactly as they'd been placed in 1998. But the inside of the marble facing showed scratches, deep gouges in the stone, patterns that looked like fingernails dragging across marble. And the metal seal that had been welded shut showed clear evidence of force applied from inside, bent, stressed, eventually broken enough to push the marble facing open a fraction of an inch. The family requested the crypt be resealed immediately. we complied, using modern materials and stronger welding techniques. I installed an additional sensor focused specifically on Crypt 17, set to alert me of any temperature changes or movement. That night, I monitored the feeds from home. At 2:07 in the morning, the new sensor triggered. I pulled up the live infrared footage and watched. The cold spot appeared again, same position, same human shape. But this time, something was different. The cold spot was inside the crypt, behind the marble facing that we'd just sealed. I could see it on the thermal imaging, a distinctly cold presence standing inside Crypt 17, pressed against the marble from within. I watched for 6 hours. The cold spot remained inside the crypt, radiating cold that seeped through the marble facing and lowered the temperature in the corridor by several degrees. At 7:53, it vanished. The next buffet, I checked Crypt 17 in person. The new seal was intact, undamaged, but I could feel cold air coming from the crypt, and when I placed my hand on the marble facing, it was ice cold despite the climate-controlled environment maintaining a constant 68 degrees. I've continued monitoring the footage every night since then. The pattern never changes. 2:07, the cold spot appears inside Crypt 17. For 6 hours, it stands there, pressed against the marble from within. Just before 8 in the morning, it vanishes. I've stopped reporting it. The cemetery director doesn't want to disturb the family again, and there's nothing we can do that we haven't already tried. The crypt is sealed, the casket is intact, the remains are undisturbed, but something inside Crypt 17 is cold, motionless, and persistent. Last week, I was reviewing older footage from before the incidents began, trying to determine when this started. I found recordings from 1999, just months after Vincent Marsh was entombed. The cold spot was there even then, appearing every night at 2:07, standing in front of the crypt before we reinforced the seal, standing inside after we welded it shut. Vincent Marsh has been trying to get out for 25 years. Or something has been trying to get in. I don't know which possibility disturbs me more. I've learned that infrared cameras see things invisible to the human eye. They detect heat, cold, the thermal signatures of presence, even when that presence can't be seen in visible light. And I've learned that some crypts are colder than they should be. Some seals break from the inside, and some thermal signatures are human-shaped but generate cold instead of heat. Crypt 17 remains sealed. Vincent Marsh remains entombed. But every night at 2:07, something stands in that space, and the infrared footage keeps recording. If you ever find a candle burning on a grave with no wax beneath it, don't blow it out. Just walk away and let it finish on its own. My name is Rafael Ortiz, and I have worked as landscape lead at St. Catherine's Cemetery in Portland, Oregon for the past 19 years. I oversee grounds maintenance, coordinate planting schedules, manage our landscape crew, and ensure that every section of our 60-acre property remains dignified and well kept. I understand plants, soil, seasonal cycles, and the natural rhythms of cemetery work. Before this past year, I thought I understood everything that grew or existed in this place. I was wrong. The grave belongs to a woman named Claire Dennison, 1947 to 1981. She died at 34, cause of death listed as complications from pneumonia. Her headstone is simple gray granite, positioned in the older section near a cluster of oak trees. According to our records, she has no family buried nearby, no regular visitors noted in our logs, nothing that would explain the weekly offerings. I first noticed the candles about 8 months ago during my Sunday morning inspections. I arrive early on Sundays, usually around 5 in the morning, to walk the grounds before my crew arrives at 7. It's peaceful then, just me and the dawn light, the cemetery silent except for birdsong and the occasional rustle of wind through trees. That first Sunday in February, I was walking through the older section when I saw a white candle on Claire Dennison's grave. It was positioned carefully in the center of the flat marker, a simple white taper candle, maybe 8 inches tall, unlit but recently placed. The wax was clean, no dust or debris, suggesting it had been left within the past day or two. I assumed it was a family member or friend observing an anniversary, perhaps the date she died or her birthday. People leave offerings all the time: flowers, coins, small mementos. A candle wasn't unusual. I made a note to remove it after a few days if it remained part of our standard maintenance protocol. The next Sunday, there was a new candle in the same spot. Same type, same size, same careful placement in the center of the marker. The previous candle was gone, as if whoever left the new one had removed the old one first. This pattern continued every single Sunday for months. I started arriving earlier, hoping to catch whoever was leaving the candles. 5 in the morning became 4:30, then 4 o'clock. But no matter how early I arrived, the candle was always already there, positioned perfectly on Claire Dennison's grave. I checked our security footage. We have cameras covering the main entrance and several key areas, but the older section where Claire is buried isn't monitored. I considered installing a camera specifically to solve this mystery, but something made me hesitate. The candles weren't causing any harm, weren't violating any cemetery policies. Whoever was leaving them was clearly devoted, showing up every week without fail for months. In June, something changed. I arrived at my usual time, around 4:30 in the morning, and approached Claire's grave to find the weekly candle. It was there, positioned as always, but this time it was lit. A small flame flickered at the tip, burning steadily in the still morning air. I stopped, confused. I'd arrived earlier than usual that day, barely past 4 in the morning. Someone would have needed to light the candle just minutes before I arrived, maybe even while I was walking through the cemetery. I looked around, searching for whoever had been there. The older section was empty, silent, no footprints in the dew-wet grass except my own, no sign that anyone else had been walking through that area. I approached the candle, intending to blow it out. We don't allow open flames in the cemetery due to fire risk. But as I got closer, I noticed something odd. The candle had burned down significantly, not just a few minutes of burning, but hours. It was maybe half its original height, wax pooled at the base, flame steady and bright. But I'd been in the cemetery for less than 10 minutes, and the candle hadn't been burning when I'd passed through this section on my initial walkthrough. I specifically remembered seeing Claire's grave, with no candle at all. I checked my watch, 4:37 in the morning. I'd started my inspection at 4:15. Somehow, in the span of 22 minutes, someone had placed a candle and let it burn for what looked like several hours. I examined the grave more carefully. The wax pooled around the base of the candle was still liquid, still warm, dripping slowly down the sides. But there was something wrong with the pattern. The wax should have been accumulating on the granite marker, creating a mess that I'd need to clean up. Instead, the wax seemed to be disappearing, dripping down the sides of the candle, touching the stone, then vanishing like it was being absorbed. I watched for several minutes. The candle continued burning, wax melting and dripping, but none of it remained on the grave. The granite stayed clean, no residue, no buildup. Just that steady flame and wax that disappeared upon contact with stone. I decided to let it burn, went about my inspection route, checking other sections, making my usual notes. When I returned to Claire's grave 40 minutes later, the candle had burned down to almost nothing. Just a tiny stub with a flickering flame, barely an inch of wax remaining. I watched as it burned down completely. The final bit of wax melted, the flame guttered and went out, and there was nothing left. No wax residue on the marker, no evidence that a candle had been burning there at all, except for the faint scent of smoke in the air. The next Sunday, a new candle appeared, same spot, same type, this time unlit. I left it alone, continued my inspection, and when I passed by again an hour later, it was burning, half consumed, wax dripping and disappearing, flame steady. I started documenting each occurrence, photographed the candles, measured their dimensions, noted the times I found them, and the state they were in. The pattern became clear. Every Sunday, a fresh white candle appeared on Claire Dennison's grave. At some point during the early morning hours, it would light itself and burn for several hours, consuming completely with no residue. I researched Claire's history, found newspaper articles about her death, obituaries, memorial service announcements. She'd been a teacher, beloved by her students, died too young from an illness that today would be treatable. Her funeral had been well attended, dozens of former students speaking about her kindness and dedication. One article mentioned a tradition she'd maintained. Every Sunday morning before church, Claire would light a candle for people she was praying for. Students who were struggling, families going through hardship, anyone who needed support. She'd light a white candle, let it burn while she said her prayers, then carefully dispose of the wax before leaving for services. I found her gravesite listing in our cemetery records and noticed something I'd missed before. She was buried on a Sunday, June 7th, 1981. A Sunday morning service, early, before most of the community had started their day. Last Sunday, I arrived at 3 in the morning, earlier than I'd ever come before, hoping to finally witness how these candles appeared. I walked directly to Claire's grave in the darkness, flashlight illuminating the path. The candle was already there, already burning, already half consumed, but this time I saw something else. In the darkness around the grave, I thought I saw movement. Not substantial, not clear, just a suggestion of presence, like someone kneeling beside the grave, tending to the candle, keeping vigil. I turned off my flashlight and stood in the darkness, letting my eyes adjust. The candle flame provided the only light, and in that small circle of illumination, I could see what looked like a shadow, human shaped but not quite solid, positioned beside the grave in an attitude of prayer. I didn't approach, didn't speak, just stood there, watching as the candle burned down, as the shadow remained kneeling, as the dawn slowly lightened the eastern sky. When the candle finally guttered out, the shadow faded with it, dispersed like morning mist, leaving nothing but clean granite and the scent of smoke. I've stopped trying to catch whoever leaves the candles, stopped documenting, stopped investigating. Some rituals, I've learned, are meant to continue undisturbed. Every Sunday, Claire Dennison receives her candle. Every Sunday, it burns without leaving residue. And in every Sunday, if you're there in the darkness before dawn, you can see her keeping her own vigil. She lit candles for others her entire life. Now someone, or something, lights candles for her. Some prayers, I've learned, continue long after the one who spoke them is silent. Some offerings are reciprocal, and some flames burn without consuming, lighting the darkness for those who taught others to do the same.